Exactly. It was unbelievable. I've never heard of an executive like this. I mean, he was generous, not just with his money, but with his time. I mean, if any of his 1,000 employees walked up to him at Zappos and said, I want to talk to you, he'd hand them his cell phone and say, put in a meeting.
My guest today is Kirsten Grind. Kirsten is an enterprise reporter for the Wall Street Journal. She has received more than a dozen national awards for her work, including a Pulitzer Prize finalist citation and a Loeb Award. Her latest book, which she co-authored with fellow Wall Street Journal reporter Catherine Hsieh, is Happy at Any Cost, the revolutionary vision and fatal quest of Zappos CEO Tony Hsieh. Tony built Zappos, an online shoe retailer, into an industry powerhouse that was later acquired by Amazon in 2009 for $1.2 billion. Tony was also a Las Vegas developer and an all-around beloved entrepreneur and was famous for spreading happiness. He lived and breathed his philosophy, instilling an ethos of joy at his company and outlining his vision for a better workplace in his New York Times bestseller, Delivering Happiness. When Tony died suddenly in November of 2020, the news shook the business and tech world. I recently sat down with Kirsten, and we talked about how Tony's obsession with happiness masked his darker struggles with addiction, mental health, and loneliness, and how we can conceptualize success and define happiness in our own modern age. Kirsten, thanks so much for coming on the show. I greatly appreciate it, and I really look forward to it. So a couple of weeks ago, when your publicist sent us the book, and I couldn't get in contact with you for whatever reason. My producer couldn't get in contact with you. And then when we did finally get connected, I had this book, I read it, and it was sitting on my dresser, and it was like disturbing. You're smiling. For those who are listening in as on the podcast, Kirsten's smiling because it really is depressing.
I'm smiling, but it is a disturbing book. Thank you so much for having me, though. I really appreciate it.
Folks, the name of the book is Happy at Any Cost, the revolutionary vision and fatal quest of Zappos CEO Tony Hsieh. Now, before we even begin and why you wrote this book, by the way, it's a really, really powerful book, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. Who is Tony Hsieh from a business perspective, and what is his impact in the online world?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Tony Hsieh, he's most associated as being the longtime CEO of the online shoe company Zappos. Now, listen, like everything's online now, right? But back in the day, in the early 2000s, Tony really revolutionized online shopping with Zappos. And Amazon bought Zappos in 2009 for $1 billion. He became famous because of that. He's also really well known as a developer of downtown Las Vegas, which, by the way, is not the strip area that everyone knows. It's the other side
it's
kind
of
a
Vegas.
Forgotten corner, yes, of Las Vegas. And he dedicated $350 million of his own money to redevelop this area. He was also really well known as a workplace visionary. He wrote the best-selling book, Delivering Happiness, all about how you should make your customers and employees happy. So those were all the reasons Tony became quite famous.
Right. And I want to tell you, literally before I came here to the studio, in my house are 3 boxes of Zappos that just came with Zappos on them. Because my wife loves the company. And after reading your book, there was one part there about the customer service. And we'll talk about that in a second. I said, Ellen, did you have the same experience? He goes, yeah, they're really good customer service people. They're just amazing.
It's really amazing. Yes.
Amazing. Okay, so before we get into Tony's other world, let's talk about the business side. Here's a kid who, his parents are immigrants from Taiwan, right?
Right.
And they're pretty successful people. They're upwardly mobile people, right? They're what were the professions? I forgot they met in high school, I think it was. And
yes, his dad basically moved from Chicago. They moved to Chicago. They immigrated to Chicago, then moved to the Bay Area. His dad worked in the oil gas industry. His mom became a therapist. So they lived in a very I'd say high end middle class area here in the Bay Area.
Right.
Yeah, so they were doing really well.
Okay. And Asian Asian people with the stereotypes of upwardly mobile people. He goes, because you mentioned in the book, he goes right into Harvard, right? He goes to Harvard.
He goes to Harvard. He immediately after Harvard gets a job at Oracle back in the early 90s. I mean, Oracle, we all know Oracle, but even back then it was such a Silicon Valley
Hmm. Hmm.
giant. He's just immediately like bored out of his mind,
Yeah, but
basically,
even
because
before that, his mother has him practicing not one
yes.
instrument. What is it? Four instruments, I believe it was, or five?
It was many instruments, many languages he had to learn. He had a very pretty strict childhood, where he was really brought to study quite a bit, with the goal of going to somewhere like Harvard and having a career, both him and his two younger
Hmm.
brothers. His parents were well known as very nice and just friendly in the neighborhood, but yes, had these expectations for their sons
Right.
for sure.
And Tony's a brilliant guy. He's not your average kid, right?
No, he's not your average kid. He's smart from the start with also this like sort of business acumen from the start. Like he's always kind of on the side trying to start these small businesses, right? Like this worm farm. And then he does this button business and is actually like raising money. And he just has all these kind of like cool ideas.
Right. And then he hits on one idea when he's what, 1996 or so. So he's what, 23. So he's 24 years, 25 years old or somewhere around there, maybe a little younger, 23, 24. With, I remember this. I remember this company when the internet was just starting out, Link Exchange. That was his idea.
That's that's right. So Tony was actually part of this first group of web entrepreneurs, which this was almost one of my favorite parts to research of the book because it was such nostalgia. It was the 90s before the tech bubble, right? And he was in San Francisco. He had quickly quit Oracle because he was bored out of his mind. And him and his business partner came up with this idea to sort of revolutionize online advertising. Like you remember those terrible banner
Oh,
ads
with
that used
spinning,
to,
with flags flying, and it was
yes,
terrible.
oh, it was just a mess. So he basically created this way that the community could supply their own ads back and forth, and it really just took off and was growing just rapidly
So he starts his company with two other partners. Eventually, they sell it to I think it was Microsoft for
to
200, yeah,
Microsoft. Yep.
$265 million, and they sold it in 1998. So, folks, just to give you an idea, this is around the time where Google is just coming up with their idea, and it's only 3 or 4 years since Jeff Bezos is packing books into boxes in his garage. So. These are the early, early, early pioneers, and he already booked a $265 million sale.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, he was really part of that era of get rich from the internet when people were discovering all the cool things they could do on the internet. So he was very young when he became a millionaire.
Okay. So now money doesn't really impact him that much in the sense of he doesn't go out and buy flashy cars or buys an island or anything like that. He starts an incubator and an investment firm, right? Venture Frogs, right?
That's right.
And,
And they're sort of like rooting around for the next big thing. And in walks this guy with this kind of crazy little startup called selling shoes online, Zappos. The timing is kind of terrible because it's like right when the bubble is starting to
mhm.
burst. But Tony is very convinced by statistics and research, and the founder of Zappos, Nick Schwimmer, really convinced him that this was a great idea, and so Tony took it on.
Right. And just for those who, I hope you're not that young listening to the show, back in the day, Amazon or selling clothes online was a big deal. People didn't think that, you had to try them on. What about returns? It was all virgin territory. And
Oh, that's right.
especially with
Yeah,
shoes, shoes, it's like you don't go into a shoe store and try one shoe on, you try three or four different shoes on. So here was a revolutionary concept of let's sell shoes on the internet.
That's right. And I mean, it's hard to overstate that, like what a big deal it was back then. And now we can get something on Amazon in 3 hours, but back then he had free returns, fast shipping. I mean, all the stuff that we would all get very used to, but was not around back then
Right.
for sure.
So that's another thing. I had on the show a couple of weeks back. So we spoke about Elon Musk. And what most people don't know is Elon Musk didn't found Tesla. Tesla was an ongoing company. He became part of Tesla. So Tony Hsieh didn't invent or come up with Zappos. He wasn't a founder. He just took it to the next level. The idea was there, but his brilliance, and the same thing with Musk, their brilliance is to see an idea and say, we're going to take this from just an idea turn it into a major company.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, everyone kind of associates him as the founder because he kind of quickly took over as CEO when the company was really struggling during the dot-com bubble burst. But yeah, he was not the founder. He was just the very long time CEO.
Okay. So now he's a CEO and he moves the headquarters to Henderson, Nevada. And the way he does business is so amazing and so different. I shouldn't say amazing, so different than what you're taught in business school and the way most businesses are going, that CEOs and managers throughout the country are coming to Zappos just to watch and observe. I think we just said in the book, thousands, right, came to Zappos to learn from them.
Yeah, it was almost like these people were making pilgrimages
Right.
to learn about the workplace. Because here again is something that seems common now. You're always hearing about like quirky tech office spaces and WeWork and Google has all of this. But back then, Tony had Zappos, like literally it was a fun house. Everyone described it as like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. People had toys everywhere. There were games going on. They were all having fun. I mean, personally, to me, it sounded like, how did anyone get any work done? But everyone from that era at Zappos just loved it and they loved working there. And Tony had come up with these core values for the company that everyone really followed. And one of them was like, be a little quirky and weird. And everyone was quirky and everyone was a little weird. Yeah.
So you could, your own area, you could design it any way you want. If you wanted stuffed animals, it was that kind of freedom that people were just happy to be there, right?
Exactly. It was like the anti-office space, right? And they would cut off the ties of like people who came in business suits and just all of that stuff. And so they were becoming very popular for this, getting on TV and all these features, and Tony's star was really starting to rise.
And during this time also, they create, which I found fascinating, he creates that it becomes ubiquitous in Silicon Valley and tech companies, an office of happiness or something to that effect. I think McDonald's was the first to have something like this. What's the title called? The happiness officer or the
happiness? It sort of became this like gimmick, unfortunately, in a way, like this happiness officer. But Tony, he really believed in this happiness mantra. I mean, that was his whole thing. Like, he really thought that customers and employees should be happy and that the company should be working to make that the case. So I don't think they actually had a happiness title at Zappos, but they really definitely believed in it.
But everyone else started taking it, right? Throughout, I think in Google, there was someone, these were all trailblazing, putting a ping pong table in a bar. Those were new things when he was doing it.
That's right.
Okay. So now we're still in the good part of the book, folks, because it takes a real sudden turn. It doesn't really take a sudden turn. It takes a really sad turn, So now also, which I found also very, very interesting in telling about the company, was that Tony himself, because customer service was so important. Customer service, let's flesh that out. What did customer service mean?
Well, it's funny because just today at the Wall Street Journal, I wrote a story about the lack of customer service at Facebook and Instagram. So when you have trouble with your account, you can't reach anyone. It was completely the opposite at Zappos. That was Tony's whole thing, that a customer could call in and you could spend, there was no script. You could spend 3 hours on the phone with that customer, and they literally did. Like Tony himself would work the phones and talk to people about anything they wanted to talk about, definitely not just
Quantum
shoes.
computing,
And
right?
quantum computing, yes, just all kinds of crazy things. And so this became what they were known for, is this amazing customer
Now, you
service.
know what I find so interesting is back in the day when you'd order shoes on, for example, I'll give you an example, Allen Edmonds, which I've been wearing
Mhm.
Allen Edmonds for like close to 30 years. When they started to sell them online, I don't remember how, you could buy them online, but what about returning them? They couldn't be worn outside. They had to be in the same perfect condition that you got them. So meaning try them on in your house and just wear them on carpeting and don't even wear them. They couldn't be creases. They could be anything. Have to be
Right.
returned in the exact same box, exact same way. If not, there was a restocking fee. It was just a pain in the butt. So ordering shoes online was just impossible. But Zappos breaks that mold. It becomes just as easy as ordering a t-shirt.
It does. It just and Tony actually started thinking this way at his earlier company, Link Exchange. He sort of theorized, because I want to be clear, Tony was a businessman, right? Like he also wanted to make money, needed to make money for the company. So he theorized that if customers were happy, they were going to spend more. And it definitely was paying off
Right.
big time for them.
And some guy, nerdy looking guy in Seattle, Washington, was thinking the same exact thing, Jeff Bezos, where you can't, it customer is number one. Satisfy the customer is the only thing that we do here.
Exactly. And Jeff Bezos really looked at Tony and his team, and he saw what they were doing with the culture. And really, for Amazon, when they bought Zappos in 2009, it was almost a bet on Tony, because, I mean, Bezos could have just, he was selling shoes, right? Why did he need Zappos? He wanted to see how that culture was going to play out. And he made a really unusual deal, which he let Tony keep running the show autonomously from Las Vegas, which was really unheard of.
Right? Amazon's a very buttoned up company, and here he let these guys, and that was one of the deals that Tony, one of the stipulations Tony put in that deal, right?
That's right. He really wanted to make sure that Zappos could retain that culture even after it was being sold.
Okay, so it sounds like heaven to work at. This place was fun, exciting, and we didn't even talk about how Tony would walk around. There'd be a bar there, there'd be liquor that you could drink at meetings. It's not during lunch only or after hours. You could walk around with a drink, not a problem.
That's right. So alcohol, unfortunately, became interwoven in this culture in a way that in the early years of Zappos, and I'd say maybe up until like 2015, let's say, um, wasn't unusual, right? Like this is a fun culture. You might even say it's kind of a party culture. It definitely was. They were throwing these amazing, like huge parties. So it just kind of fit that there was also alcohol
Well, why
interwoven.
shouldn't there be?
That's
Why shouldn't there be, right?
right. Why shouldn't there be? That definitely started to change later, which we can get into.
Okay,
But in those years, it made sense
okay.
for sure.
So he also writes a book, or two books, I think it was. Delivering Happiness is one of them, right? Becomes a New York Times bestseller. And here's a guy that you'd look on the surface, just epitomize happiness. Like his whole being was to make others happy.
He really seemed like, if not that he was happy himself, but that's all he cared about, is making sure others were happy. And this book just took off in a way that I think probably surprised them as well, right? I mean, I think it hit a nerve with the American public because everyone was kind of looking for happiness, right? And here was this young entrepreneur saying, you can run a successful business and be happy. and you can have it all basically. And the book, I personally like have trouble sometimes reading these business self-help books, and this book was unusual because it just kind of went into Tony's stories and how he did things, and it was less preachy than some of them can be, if that makes
Yeah, no,
sense.
and also it wasn't only your own happiness, it was the happiness of everyone around you. Like he took such a vested interest in making sure that person who worked in the corner cubicle, they were happy.
Exactly. It was unbelievable. I've never heard of an executive like this. I mean, he was generous, not just with his money, but with his time. I mean, if any of his 1,000 employees walked up to him at Zappos and said, I want to talk to you, he'd hand them his cell phone and say,
Amazing.
put in a meeting. He would support you no matter what. He was the best friend. When I first started researching Tony, everyone would say, I'm a close friend of Tony Hsieh's. And I realized, I mean, he has like thousands of people that will say that about him because of his generosity, basically.
Okay, so everything seems to be going great, and happy is the culture. The business world is seeing that. Jeff Bezos is seeing that. They buy it for $1.2 billion and incorporate it and let them run it independently. So today it's still run as Zappos. You don't get something from Amazon, it's Zappos, which is amazing. Lets them have their independence, and the company seems like one big party. But you write in the beginning of the book, I think the forward, Tony's story will serve as a warning to many others not to ignore looming mental health and addiction issues. So underneath this whole entire really beautiful story about a beautiful guy, there's a darkness.
Yeah. It's really sad. And it took us, honestly, a while to get to the bottom of, because he had constructed this whole facade so well, but he suffered from likely a number of things. Probably maybe the biggest was severe social anxiety. And he had built his whole life around people. He lived in an Airstream trailer park surrounded by people. And here he was trying to cope with this kind of crippling anxiety, which he was using alcohol to deal with. He had told friends he was on the autism spectrum. He also had some form of face blindness where he had trouble recognizing even sometimes his close loved
But
ones.
you were,
And so,
wait, face blindness. Hang on a second, because that I never
yeah.
heard of. And it was so shocking to me that when he was looking in the mirror, someone had to tell him that that was him or something like that. You had in the book?
So that was an example of someone else,
Oh,
yes, that suffered from face blindness. The
crazy.
face blindness thing with Tony, because he just refused to get traditional treatment for a lot of these things, he always thought he could treat himself. A lot of this was undiagnosed. So with the face blindness, it was really hard to tell how severe it is. He did tell one person, like, I would have trouble recognizing even my mom sometimes, which sort of indicates that's a severe case. And again, imagine that you are surrounded by all these people all the time dealing with anxiety, some form of face blindness, possibly you're autistic. Anxiety often comes with depression. So he was really keeping all this together for so long by drinking copiously
Okay.
throughout the day.
Copiously. Wow, that's a big word. Okay. So, okay. I can tell you're a Wall Street Journal reporter. Okay. So he has social anxiety, some degree of autism, this face blindness. He also, and by the way, folks, this is all self-diagnosed because Tony, under the stigma of mental health issues, especially from the community and background he had, you never discuss these kinds of things, right? So he never went to a therapist to get these diagnosed.
It's possible. We don't know that for
Okay.
sure. We never heard that he did. I will say he also had the unfortunate Silicon Valley problem of believing that he could treat himself, which here is called biohacking, where you're just going to come up with all kinds of non-traditional methods to make yourself feel better. So many times while I was researching this, I was like, why can't he just get on an antidepressant? Feel like it would have solved so much,
My wife's a pharmacist, and I was asking her some of the drugs in here, and you mentioned nitrous oxide he was on, and ketamine, I think it was. And he goes, "What are you reading about?" I go, "It sounds like someone trying to self-medicate." And they
Yes.
would just, I guess if you think you're, master of the universe in a company, you could, figure out, and you go through all of these things he was trying to hack, his sleeping, trying not to sleep,
Mhm.
eating, I could control everything about my body, which was just not only false, but dangerous.
He unfortunately is not the only, especially tech executive, to try that. So a lot of these guys
Right,
really believe that there's sort of a shortcut or a better way to influence their health.
right.
Yeah.
Okay, so social anxiety, autism, face bias, ADHD. He has social anxiety. We mentioned that. He can't sleep, so he's starting to take Ambien to sleep, Adderall for ADHD, Xanax for his social anxiety, amazing amounts of alcohol throughout the day. I think someone you wrote in the book that someone who was double the size of him would be totally out of it. And Tony was walking around with 13 drinks before lunchtime. Like,
This was the trick he actually pulled because he was able to drink so much without really having an effect. And the way he did it was he would have a shot at a meeting and then go to a next meeting with different people, have another shot. So there were very few people. He doesn't have a traditional family. He's not going home to a wife or kids who are seeing this, right? He's able to get up at 7 and start the day all over again. So he was able to convince the people around him that he had this under control. It took us a long time. And honestly, research in rehab facilities and talking to experts to realize that this kind of drinking is not normal, because so many people were convinced that it was until it kind of went more
right.
downhill.
So the world gets a lot darker for him. And before we go into the darkness of his world, he's really suffering from a lot of mental health issues.
He is. And then a couple things kind of happen sort of around the same time that make it more challenging to deal with these issues. The first one is he tries this really revolutionary workplace experiment called holacracy. So that in a nutshell, there's a lot more to it, but in a nutshell, it basically flattens the corporate hierarchy. You have no bosses at work. And this is a challenge. I mean, it's a big deal. A lot of Zappos employees don't like it. He's trying it for a few years. It's unclear if it's really working out. There's benefits, there's not benefits. And then at the same time, so this is around like 2019, Amazon has now owned Zappos about 10 years. And they're sort of like, okay, like 10 years is up. Where's the money, basically? Like they start putting more pressure on Tony and Zappos to deliver profits and to meet growth
Well,
targets.
let
So,
me ask you a question. When you looked into that, I don't know if you could have
yeah,
looked into it. Were you able to get numbers to see because they're folded right into Amazon to see how the business was operating with all of this shenanigans? Were they still making money or not?
I was able to find out they were still making money, but they were only meeting like 30% of their growth targets with Amazon. So not a lot,
Hmm.
right? And here's the thing, like Tony did not care about that stuff. What he cared about was like trying to revolutionize the workplace. He didn't care about selling shoes, to be honest. And so this was hard for him. He suddenly was under this pressure to come up with the next $1 billion idea, basically, at Zappos around 2019. And it's then that he starts turning towards something else because alcohol stops working, and that's ketamine, which is usually used in medical procedures.
But even before that, isn't he going off the rails a bit? He's starting to uh, um, um, s- not know where he is, do silly things, have sort of paranoias. Isn't like a series of events happening on the bus where he thinks people are shooting at him?
That comes a bit later after he's been on ketamine a while. The progression leading up to the pandemic is more like he starts drinking a lot more. He starts, his actual good friends start kind of disappearing, and his friend group is getting younger and kind of crazier, and he's getting older. He's like 46 now, right?
And so all his
And
original friends are now getting married and settling down. They
they're
can't
getting
live
married,
as
they've had kids, and he's still single. He doesn't believe in a traditional family structure. He's becoming more isolated, basically. So he starts turning to ketamine, and he starts abusing it to an extent that his friends start getting very worried. He's not making much sense. He's walking around downtown Las Vegas like spouting ideas and talking to
But the
strangers.
irony is the man
Um,
who's selling shoes doesn't wear any. He's walking
Yes,
barefoot. I found that
exactly.
to be amazing.
Exactly. And so by the winter, right before the pandemic starts in 2020, they convince him into rehab near Park City, Utah.
That's the first
And he
time.
goes for two
Right.
weeks. Yes.
Hmm.
Yes,
Okay. So
exactly.
so really, you see here a change with not only his behavior, but also, as you pointed out, the people who are surrounding him. Because the people surrounding him are no longer friends. They're, I wouldn't say enablers, really parasites. They're really living off him, his wealth. They're taking, I wouldn't say advantage 100%, but here was the mother lode, and here was a guy worth hundreds of millions of dollars, kooky ideas, crazy things, and he was pretty free with his money.
Another thing happened that is kind of crucial to understand why that group changed, and that's the pandemic, right? So remember back to early 2020, the world was just shut down, and Tony basically got stuck in Park City, Utah after rehab. And at that point, um, there were few people he could get to join him there because everyone was on lockdown, even his good friends, they're with their families there. He couldn't, so the people he was getting were sort of this like second tier, like not really his true people coming to Park City to see what he was going to do next there.
Right. So he goes to Park City. Let's discuss that for a second. He goes there with it sounded like Jim Jones, building a town.
I
It
know.
got crazy
Yes.
because he really did, and I'm not in a negative sense, but he had a cult-like personality. Not he didn't develop that and say I'm going to be a cult leader, but people gravitated to him. The way I got this from the book, as if he was a cult-like figure, just to be in his inner circle and be in his sphere was a big deal.
Definitely. And like he was accused of jokingly running a cult for years. That wasn't like a new thing. But in Park City, the tenor of it really changed. It became less joking and more like, we're here for Tony. He has this grand vision for Park City, which by the way was to solve world peace. He was going to solve world peace in Park City and transfer that blueprint to other
All right, so
communities.
right there is red flag number 4. As soon as you hear about world peace
Yes.
in Park City, not saying Park City's not a peaceful place, but when you have those grandiose ideas, there's a detachment from reality. The world doesn't work that way. As you know, I don't mean to be
Right.
Debbie
Well,
Downer, but that's what it is.
no, it's totally true. And unfortunately by this time Tony has become this is not real Tony, right? This is an addict speaking. This is someone who has now had a couple of really severe mental health breakdowns. You mentioned the one on the bus when him and his friends were driving from Park City to Montana. He suddenly is having all these hallucinations after having so much ketamine. And
What does
so
ketamine do? I think my wife was telling me a veterinary drug for animals.
exactly. And it gives you this kind of like weird spiritual high. Now, to be clear, ketamine actually can be used in the correct way under medical supervision to treat things like depression, right? But Tony, again, hacking his own health, was using it just in the way he thought it should be used. So he was basically abusing it. And then when his friends finally took ketamine away, he turned to another kind of party drug, nitrous oxide or whippets. And that's when you're getting a high from like a whipped cream just canister dispenser,
And nitrous
right?
oxide is laughing gas that you get at a dentist office.
Yes. And the high lasts like 30 seconds. And then you have to keep doing hits to keep it going. So he was just searching around for like whatever would help him through this time.
And it's during this time that um, he has this mansion, a big, huge house, right, in Park City. I don't know, ranch. What was it?
Yeah, he buys this giant mansion and it becomes this sort of hub for this group of people who are now surrounding him, taking his money, coming up with quote unquote business ideas, and they call it the ranch. It's like this 17,000-foot mansion on a lake in Park City.
And he has security guards outside.
He's gotten really paranoid. So there's like dozens of security guards stationed outside this ranch. He's hired court reporters to follow him around in case he's making any business deals. And by the way, he was always big on sticky notes. Now there's sticky notes all over his property, and that's where they are writing down business deals, like actual contracts on these sticky notes. So it's just taken a turn. I mean, it's just become crazy, basically. This is the summer of 2020.
Right. So COVID has a big deal to do with this, right? This isolation
Yes.
for this guy who is losing touch with reality. Look, sane people started losing it, during COVID, and now you have
Definitely.
the worst of the worst around you, and you're an addict, and you're not getting help, and you have mental health issues. It's like something got to give.
He was definitely a COVID casualty in a way because that isolation, that it just was the worst for him. And even the people he was trying to build a group around him, but it was the wrong group.
Right. So he's really in dire straits. I'm just speeding up the story because I want to get to one point about the mental health. Because, folks,
Yeah.
when you get this book and you read it, it's troubling. It really is. I can't say that when I put the book down, I wasn't looking forward to picking it back up again because you know how it ends. It really ends bad. And I say that as a compliment because it's not a linear timeline. You jump around, which I think is a great device to give the reader not only a break, but to compare and contrast to what the world was and what the world is. So kudos to you and Catherine. But this book has an appendix with mental health resources. National Alliance on Mental Health, National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, Crisis Text Line, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, the National Institute of Mental Health, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. So you don't get many books about business leaders with all of those, uh, all the information on mental health and suicide. So why did you write this book? What was the message?
We've been asked that quite a lot. Why did you write this book? Because, and I'm so glad you asked that because it's a very important point to get across. Number one, there would be no point in writing this book just about a sad story from this guy who unfortunately died. What we really hope people get out of this book is to actually pay attention to their own mental health issues. That is 100% why this is an important story, because otherwise, the fact that Tony was a brilliant business leader, yes, that's always important. But his story has actually become more important, I think, since his death. And I personally just hope more than anything that someone's going to read this and say, you know what, like, why not go to the therapist or why not go to
Right.
the doctor and just check these things out? Why not start meditating? Whatever it is.
Right.
Um,
Well, you knew you were on a journey when your first pages of the book, Note to Readers, by the last paragraph, you write, our goal in telling Tony, I shouldn't say you write, you and Catherine write, if you or someone you know is struggling, we have included an appendix with information on mental health and substance abuse resources. Our goal in telling Tony's story is to break the cycle of silence and isolation around these issues with the hopes of destigmatizing, reaching out for help when you're struggling. People are there to help, even when it might not seem like it. And the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, you give that number, and the crisis text line provide immediate around-the-clock assistance.
I mean, I think we just really felt like if we were going to write a book like this, we had to provide some resources too, right? And it's especially a huge issue among entrepreneurs because a lot of these same traits or afflictions, I guess, that Tony was dealing with is what make you a great entrepreneur, right? So it's sort of like a catch-22 in a way.
Right. You know, you put in the book Dr. Freeman's study. I don't remember who Dr. Freeman was, but I just wrote that down. A psychologist or some scientist?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Entrepreneurs were twice as likely to have depression, 3 times more likely to have a substance abuse disorder, 6 times as likely to have ADHD, and 11 times as likely to have bipolar disorder as were non-entrepreneurs.
It's shocking, isn't it? And, you know, it's just, I'm here in the Bay Area and Silicon Valley, and I can tell you that it is like basically never talked about. And in fact, to show if you're a young entrepreneur, so many of them are like in their 20s or whatever, you can't show weakness like that. You're trying to get your next funding round, right? So it's like we have to change the way people are thinking about that. And it shouldn't be, if you're having a mental health issue, it should just be like any other health issue, right?
You have like heart disease or you have cancer, you have a mental health issue, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You write here that across the U.S., 1 in 5 people experience a mental health condition each year. 1 in 20 experiences a serious mental illness such as schizophrenia or severe depression and bipolar disease. So you're talking about 5% of the population has a severe depression, a severe mental health issue, and 20% have a mental health condition each year. And you would think that this would be something on the front page or something that every 5th person you meet will, but not talked about.
It's just crazy. And when those statistics I know must also be low because half of these people aren't reporting, right?
Yeah.
So it's a huge problem. And so we really tried with this book to make it much broader than just about Tony Hsieh. We really tried to get into these issues and happiness and all of that.
And what's really astonishing is that it comes from the guy who was happy, who you thought, if he writes a book delivering happiness, his whole goal in life is to make people happy. Every customer service call is an opportunity to speak to people and have a great day with them and talk to them. And here's a guy just dying on the inside.
His whole business is happiness. It's really unbelievable. And I think, you know, one thing that really stuck with me about Tony is he said this thing in an interview once, I think to the New York Times, where he said, I really pick up from the people around me. So if you're an extrovert, I'm going to be an extrovert. If you're an introvert, I'm going to be an introvert. And I think that's how he was surviving. He was just feeding off everyone else's energy until he couldn't anymore.
I want you to touch on, which I found so amazing. And I have such respect for her now, not just as a folk singer, but just as a human being. And that's Jewel, who had a couple of great hits, great folk singer, who became friends with Tony and was so heavily vested in helping him through his mental crisis.
She was one of the few people that truly tried to save him in the end. So they had become friends years earlier. And ironically, she had been trying to work on mental health issues for Zappos employees at Tony's request. And then when they would do these sort of workshops to like look into themselves, Tony would just disappear basically. But so they had known each other for a while. And she comes to see him in Park City while all this is going on. And she's just shocked at the state of him. He's emaciated. He hasn't been eating. He's on drugs. He's talking nonsense about saving the world. And she writes him this
But before
letter.
you
I
told
mean,
before you said the letter, you mentioned how the house, the floor, you couldn't even see the floor.
uh,
There were so many nitrous oxide canisters.
he's surrounded by nitrous oxide. He again, with this world peace mission he had come up with, he's thinking, he's trying to save the world from waste. So he's trying not to throw away trash. So there's trash everywhere, and what sinks and showers are just running because they're trying to make it seem like waterfalls. I mean, it's just total nonsense. But all the people around Tony are so terrified to tell him what is really happening or to pull him out of that. They just don't know how to deal with it. So they're just going along with it, basically.
Okay, I cut you off. I'm sorry. We came to
No,
one of the best
no, not
parts
at all.
where Jewel writes a letter, which is a tearjerker, which is really sad.
So, yeah, she tries to,
Well, but
she
by the way,
clearly
excuse me a second. I'm sorry to
sees.
interrupt you one more time.
Yeah.
That's my ADHD talking. So forgive me. So, Jewel, did you meet Jewel?
What's that?
Did you
Sorry.
meet Jewel throughout your interviews or speak to her?
So I have to give you this speech that I give about who we spoke to, which is a lot of people in general spoke on background, which means we don't cite who we spoke to. And we kind of explain that in the end notes too, in our sourcing.
So let's move on.
Yeah.
So Jewel writes this letter.
She writes this letter. So she clearly sees that Tony needs help, right? And so she writes this beautiful, heartfelt letter telling him that he needs to get help and literally saying that he is going to die if he does not get help. And she tries to send it privately to him because she knows he's surrounded by this group of enablers who are just at this point taking his money. And still the letter ends up getting posted publicly on the walls of Tony's mansion, and all the people around him are basically making fun of it on sticky notes. It's just terrible.
Tragic. Okay, so the last days of his life are really sad. He goes to New London, Connecticut.
He goes to New London. He first goes to Puerto Rico. Basically, Jewel starts secretly trying to come up with this plan to get him help. And I don't know this for sure, but I think Tony may have figured something out because he suddenly starts traveling. He goes to Alaska, he goes to Puerto Rico, and then he's in New London visiting a woman who he was living with in Park City. And they start fighting. They're having this big fight because Tony has trash everywhere and he's fascinated with fire. He's always lighting fires and candles. And they basically get in this big fight. It's November 2020. And they're supposed to all go to Hawaii the next morning. So to kind of broker a peace until they leave for the airport, one of the other employees suggests that Tony sleeps in this adjacent pool shed next to the house.
Okay, go ahead. What happens?
And then that is when it kind of all goes downhill. So it's hard to know exactly what happened at that point because it's the middle of a freezing night in Connecticut. The fire investigators, who I spent quite a bit of time with, only have like grainy video footage to go on. But basically, Tony is in there with whippets, his drugs, with candles, with a propane heater that should not be inside. And suddenly at 3 a.m, when his brother goes to get him, there's fire coming out of the shed and they can't get him out. He has locked the door from the inside and they are eventually able to get the fire department over there to pull him out. He's not badly burned, but he's unconscious from the fire smoke. And he unfortunately passes away 9 days later.
And all those around him, and when he passes away, the outpouring is just immense.
It's huge. I mean, this was shocking to so many people. He was only 46. He was so well respected and so beloved. I mean, it's hard to overstate how beloved Tony Hsieh was. At first, I thought this had to be fake because so many people just loved him so much, but it's true. I mean, he had this way of like uniting everyone, and so it was a real shock to so many people.
How you were at the Journal at the you're at the Journal now, but at the time,
Yeah.
I remember reading the article. I remember reading it. You know, they said there was a fire, and I thought, all right, sad, he died in a fire. But then there was more stories that were coming out, and I think there were your stories in the Journal that you were
Mhm.
reporting on.
Yeah.
What made you say like, let me do some digging here? This just doesn't seem right because the story would have not, I wouldn't say died, but who's maybe someone else might have picked it up. But let's put that aside for a second. If he would have died in the shed under mysterious circumstances and moved on, all right, it would have been a tragic story to begin with. But you and Catherine had this nose for investigative journalism, and you saw or you smelled something was not right.
So the circumstances on their face were very strange. Yes. So that's number one. And also, there was some like police chatter about him being barricaded in that shed. So right away, it was like, what is happening? But then Catherine covers Las Vegas and gambling. Both of us began to hear these kind of crazy stories about what was going on in Park City. And no one had really heard anything about Tony from the pandemic. Most people publicly didn't even know he had moved to Park City from Las Vegas. So we just knew there was like way more to that story for sure.
So
We just dove
what
in.
did you start? Where was your first when you? Because look, you could have hit a dead end, right? But you started and you peeled away the first layer of the onion. You said, "My gosh, there's a story here." What was
Yeah.
that? What was that when you saw that first step and you said, "Boy, this is deep"? Because look, you could have hit a dry well, right? You could have said, "No, you just got locked in by accident. Move on."
Totally. And that happens a lot in reporting, as you know. We were really lucky to reach a couple of his very good friends early on who knew kind of what was going on. And then the friends in Las Vegas, they were incentivized to help because they couldn't believe what had happened to him in Park City with these other people around him. So there was a lot of convincing to get people to talk about what had been going on in Park City. So it took us a while, but we were lucky enough to find people that trusted us with Tony's story up until then. Yeah.
And what happened with his parents?
Oh, his poor parents. I mean, they tried to stage an intervention attempt in the summer of 2020 and just got completely shut out by the enablers surrounding Tony. And since then, they've been trying to wind down his estate. So, I mean, he died without a will with tens of millions of dollars. And if you can believe it, some of these people surrounding Tony in those last months have actually filed claims against the estate, trying to get money from it. Some of them based on these sticky note contracts. And the family has really fought back, saying, listen, he was clearly very sick. He clearly had no idea what was going on, and you're asking for money. And they've been actually mostly successful
Wow, of getting the money?
of fending off those claims from these
Oh,
people
well,
who
the family's been successful. These people haven't
the
been.
family has been
Okay.
successful, not the people.
Wow,
Yes,
what a
exactly.
it's just wild. So, um, you spent what, a year or two writing this book?
We've been reporting it pretty much since he died in November
It's almost 2
2020.
years,
Yeah.
right? So it's a
Yeah.
year and a half.
Well, about a year. Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
time flies, huh?
I
Amazing,
know.
amazing. No, I just remember hearing of this. I got on my phone a thing. Tony Hsieh. I said, "What?" It
Yeah.
just didn't make any sense. But what did you learn about addiction, mental health, mental illness, and the way most of society treats mental health?
Oh my gosh, I've learned so much. I have been so lucky in my life to not have to deal with either of these issues, addiction or mental health issues, really firsthand. I spent a day at the rehab facility Tony went to in Park City, Cirque Lodge. The thing that I really had the most questions about, which I think applies to actually a lot of people, is when you can tell someone has a problem. Because and what I learned is if you are questioning it, or if someone is drinking as much as Tony was or doing that many drugs, it doesn't matter if they're showing up to work on time or if they seem lucid and they're not hungover. They're clearly covering up another issue. And I didn't know that, actually, if you can believe it. I mean, I didn't realize that that kind of drinking definitely meant you might be suffering from something. And so I
Right.
think that was really instructive for me. And I've actually applied it to my own life.
Yeah.
So,
The addictive behavior is symptomatic to the actual problem that the person has, you know.
yes, exactly. Yeah.
And, so I was thinking about this. After all the research you've done, could Tony have been saved?
Oh, he was so close to being saved by Jewel, who was like kind of working with his brother to try and get this specialized doctor in to help him. There were so many instances he could have been saved in that last year, maybe even by the people around him. I will say that, and this is not to let anyone off the hook, but I will say that another thing I've learned is helping an addict is very hard.
Impossible.
And even it can be
Right,
impossible.
because it's the
And Tony was constantly reassuring everyone he was fine. He was telling people he was in a metamorphosis and the next stage was sobriety. It's very hard.
Yeah. I've been involved in an organization for a while now that not as actively involved, but in an organization that deals with addiction, people with addictive behaviors.
Oh, good
And
for you.
and the person running it, phenomenal human being. And he said, no matter what, it has to come from the addict. So
hmm
if the addict doesn't acknowledge the problem, you could stand on your head and spit wooden nickels. Nothing's going to change.
Exactly. It's why Tony would only agree to 2 weeks in rehab. He never thought he had a problem.
No, he never identified, and the people that he kept surrounding himself with, all the addictive behaviors and patterns were there. There's nothing that you look at and you say, this is atypical. This is typical behavior. He just
It is.
it's
Yeah.
unfortunately, and reading this book, I give his mother, not so much as father, you didn't mention that much, but the mother, she saw through it, and she saw the problem, tried to get the intervention, coordinate with Jewel, the brother, they're working, but I after when I put the book down the other day, I said, even if they did all that, it was still an uphill battle because he didn't want it. He didn't see the problem.
It would have been so hard. I mean, he would have been under conservatorship, which we all know from like Britney Spears, right? And he would have probably been fighting that tooth or nail. The sad thing is, in those 9 days when he was pulled from the shed and before he actually passed away, when he was just unconscious in the hospital, a lot of his friends actually thought that this would save him, because that would have been 9 days away from the enablers, time away from his drugs. Like, he would have been put in a hospital. They actually thought if he woke up, which they thought he would, maybe he would be okay. And then he obviously wasn't.
I read the end, and it was a lot of wishful thinking. Jewel even
Yes.
getting that professional great guy, I forgot who that was, to speak to him. Like that,
Yeah.
the whole plan pivoted on that, right? This guy was supposed to speak to Tony and turn him
Yes.
around, like, please, if it was that
I
easy.
know it would have
If it
been a
was-
stretch. Agree. Yes.
He didn't see the problem. He didn't have a problem. Everyone else around him had a problem, so he was fine, and he was
That's
managing
right.
it. So what are you telling me? You're coming here to tell me I'm from Mars? No, you're from Mars. I'm not. So it looked. I wonder if there are people out there in the podcast who, if you read this, please put a comment. If you deal in addiction or you're professionally trained in mental health, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as to what you think after you read this book. If if all of these plans would have worked, if Tony, I guess the only thing was conservatorship, to put into, but he had money and he had power and he had lawyers and he had enablers that if he went down, they went down. So gosh, you have several $100 million against, the other side of the table. It would have been a hard deal.
It would have been really hard either way, for sure. It did certainly feel to me like there were spots where there could have been more attempts made, at least. But I think it does sound like he was going down a hill where it was inevitable, for sure.
And also from his group that hung around him, these people, boy, oh boy, I hope there's justice somewhere because they didn't pull the trigger or they didn't light the fire or they didn't give him the drugs, but it was pretty close, to
right. And they're just going on with their normal lives now.
And now suing the family to get money to them with a mentally ill person. Wow.
I know.
Wow. I hope I'm missing something on that, but the end result. I
don't think you are.
The end result is he died in a terrible situation, and his family's left to pick up the pieces, and everyone else is left to wonder what his life would have been like, and what maybe if anyone could have got world peace, it could have been him. He could have been the guy.
I mean, if anyone could have done it, it would have been him. Honestly, like he revolutionized workplace happiness. Why not world peace?
Who knows?
Yeah,
it got to come from people who think just totally different. Kirsten Grind. The name of the book, folks, is "Happy at Any Cost: The Revolutionary Vision and Fatal Quest of Zappos CEO Tony Hsieh." And I do want to warn you, it's an outstanding, outstanding read, but it's troubling. But I think we need to be troubled. I think, with 20% of the population having some mental health issue, if anything, this book should be a wake-up call to everyone around you that no matter who you are, and people right under your nose could be having issues.
Right, exactly. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for just an outstanding, outstanding job. You and Catherine, your co-author. And this is not your first book, right? You have another book.
It's not. Yeah, I wrote about the largest bank failure in U.S. history after the financial crisis, Washington Mutual.
Wow.
So that book is The Lost Bank.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. And boy, oh boy, it's I remember that like it was literally yesterday, 2008. And the cascading of, I don't know, I just think I'm financially crisised out. I've read almost every book, and it was just, you don't want to get out of bed after you read these books. It's so,
exactly.
It's like, oh my gosh.
Especially with what's going on now, for sure.
Yeah. Kirsten, all the power to you. Continued success. And thank you for bringing to the public a really difficult story, but one that, hopefully might save people.
I hope so too. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Charles Mizrahi Show. If you're a new listener, welcome. If you've been listening for a while, we're glad to have you back. Either way, we'd love to know what you think of the show. Please leave a review if you listen on Apple Podcasts. Reviews make it easier for others to find the show. You can also see the video of the interview on the Charles Mizrahi Show channel on YouTube.